and welcome to Capitol Hill. I'm Lyndal Curtis. Parliament House was replete with media moguls today as two parliamentary inquiries got underway into the media changes proposed by the government. Most major media owners and chief executives continued their criticism of plans for a public interest media advocate to oversee self-regulation for the print and online media. There were differences of opinion, though, over the plans to scrap the rule, preventing a TV company from broadcasting to more than three-quarters of the population. Joining me to discuss today are Labor Senator Doug Cameron and Liberal Senator Scott Ryan. Welcome to you both.
G'day, Lyndal.
We'll go first to the arguments of the media bosses before the inquiry into media regulation.
What have we done that would warrant such legislation being passed? What have we done that would warrant your intrusion into our company in this way? What has our company done that would warrant any of this legislation?
The proposals will affect every Australian and the quality of their democracy. This is bad legislation with a bad process which can only have a bad, severely detrimental outcome.
Under the legislation, unless you were accredited, you would not have an exemption under the Privacy Act, which means that you could not gather information about people without their consent. So that is, a nuclear option. It is a nuclear option because it would basically shut down a predominantly news-gathering organisation.
Doug, you were in the inquiry all day today. Have you been persuaded by what seems to be the fundamental argument that media freedom, which is hard-won, should not easily be given up?
Oh, look, I don't have any argument about media freedom. All that's being said, and I think there's a bit of hysteria, hysterical responses from some of the media moguls has been a bit of a joke. What we are saying is that if you have a code of conduct, if you have a press council and they set standards, then those standards should be adhered to. And that has not been happening.
But it's a problem that there is a lack of fine detail about exactly what the role of the public interest media advocate would be and exactly what public interest is.
Well, public interest, it's interesting that News Limited could actually define the public interest in its code of conduct for its employees in 2006, yet now there's no comment on public interest. Look, public interest is quite what it is. Are things being done in the interest of the public? And what we have at the moment is a huge challenge between commercial interest and public interest. And the media moguls are saying it's all about commercial interest. They don't want to mention public interest.
Scott, does the system work perfectly now? The coalition's not going to support these proposals, but does the system work perfectly now?
And we've said we're going to repeal them if Doug Cameron and Stephen Conroy have their way. Let's imagine the end of this year and a press conference with Doug or Stephen, and there are two newspaper journalists there. One could be from a government-approved, accredited newspaper, and the other one might not be. And if they're not from someone that the bureaucrat who's appointed by a politician actually ticks off their code of conduct, they are subject to a different set of laws. Let's just go back and imagine...
But isn't that the way it works now to some extent, that you can have a print journalist at a media conference and a broadcast journalist, and the broadcast journalist is overseen by government regulation. It's not exactly in the same way it's proposed.
And that's the point I was going to make. The government and the Commonwealth have never regulated the content of newspapers outside wartime. And this proposal has government-appointed bureaucrats appointed by politicians, determining effectively whether some journalists are exempted from laws or some journalists have laws applied to them that make them unable to do their jobs. This is unprecedented when it comes to newspapers.
Does the system, though, of self-regulation work as well as it could?
Whether it works as well as it could, I won't say. Is it perfect? We all get criticised. None of us like it. Politicians who are afraid of criticism should choose a different job. I tell you what will be worse, and that is a politician of any side of politics, a government or opposition, nominating someone who then gets to decide whether some journalists are accredited or some aren't. That's much, much worse.
We've had a press council for 37 years. The press council has been underfunded. Companies have just simply said to the press council, we are not going to accept your rulings. They've walked away from the press council. They've kept it underfunded. what the government is saying. If you have a press council and you have standards, those standards should be met. There is not one media mogul has been able to answer that position today.
But isn't it the case that during the discussion about the Finkelstein reforms and about convergence, the Press Council was in fact beefed up? The companies put more money into it.
After 37 years, and the Press Council itself is still saying it's still underfunded, it's still got a problem that it could be closed down very quickly by one company moving away and just simply saying, we don't like your rulings, we're walking away. What's wrong with overseeing the rules, the self-regulation rules that the Press Council set up? We're simply saying we don't want to end up with another Murdoch-type position here as we had in the UK. Let's make sure the rules are there and the rules are adhered to.
But isn't it the case that what's happened in the United Kingdom, particularly with the phone hacking, has not been replicated in Australia, and that the government maybe hasn't done enough to say what the problems are that it thinks this would solve?
Well, you see, I said to Kim Williams today that you know, your arguments are the same arguments that the Murdoch stable were putting to the parliamentarians in the UK. They're saying, no, there's not a problem. Then it was an individual journalist was the problem. Then it was an individual newspaper that was the problem. Then it was the Murdoch stable that was the problem. So we've heard all these arguments before. Let's get transparency.
There's no evidence of any of those things happening in Australia.
And there was none in the UK.
This is extraordinary. Only the arrogance of Stephen Conroy and Doug Cameron and the Labor Party would think that after all their disasters, it is appropriate for a bureaucrat appointed by a politician to start regulating newspapers in this way. It's never happened before, and it shouldn't happen now. You said yourself, Lyndal, there's been no need. There's been no case established. Doug is merely trying to conflate two different countries because they have a similar shareholder.
If I could ask you about something that was raised in the House of Representatives that you may not have seen because you're in the Senate today. Your leader, Tony Abbott, moved a suspension of standing orders arguing for freedom of speech and freedom of the press. Anthony Albanese, the leader of the House, responded to that, saying that in the past the coalition has gagged community organisations receiving government funding from criticising government policies.
It's completely different. It is completely different to say someone who receives taxpayers' money should spend that on the job for which they are paid, to regulating newspapers, which the government has never had a role in. So to set up a newspaper, you just need a printing press and a journalist.
In some circumstances?
No, it's not nothing to do with that at all. Because what this is about is regulating what the media write. And as Doug Cameron and Helen Polly said today in the Senate, this is all about nobbling News Limited. Every Liberal's grown up in Melbourne.
Where have I said that?
You've been criticising and beating up on News Limited, and you interject it across the chamber. Every Liberal's grown up with the Age beating up on us in Melbourne for months and years.
If I could move on quickly, there's another proposal being discussed, and that's what's called removing the reach rules.
Yeah.
Doug, are you satisfied that there would continue to be strong local news services provided if mergers such as the one rumoured between Channel 9 and Southern Cross Media went ahead?
Well, Channel 9 went so far today as to say that they would give a written contract to say there would be more local news. Other media people are saying, no, it's going to be the end of local production. I'm more to the view that if it was lifted, you would get more local content.
Why do you say that?
Because there's a constraint in terms of financing. If you get some of these companies in that give commitments and clear, unequivocal commitments like Channel 9 are prepared to do, that will widen the amount of local content. They've said they'll employ more local journalists.
Scott, and what do you think about the proposal to remove the 75% reach rule?
Well, I haven't been privy to the hearings today. Doug has, and the point you made about contracts being signed and commitments with respect to resourcing local television news, I think we'd have to look at what happened in radio, where there was some aggregation in radio, and I know that led to some mixed results, and I know some of my colleagues in different parts of regional Australia have had quite different experiences.
We might move on now to the government's moves to beef up the policing of the abuse of 457 visas. The government announced today that the Fair Work Ombudsman will monitor and enforce compliance with visa conditions.
The protection of the paying condition of all workers, no matter what background they come from, is a core Labor value. This Labor government is about making sure that our workplaces are both cooperative, productive and fair. Regardless of the country of origin you come from, you shouldn't come to Australia and be exploited or ripped off.
Doug, is what the government's done enough to police the system that it says there are abuses in?
Well, I think it's a good start. I've probably had more experience with 457 visas than any politician in the Parliament. I was a union official who was raising the problems with 457 visas years ago under the Howard government. And I saw the rip-offs that were taking place. I saw the intimidation. I saw the mafia-type intimidation against some Philippine workers' families in the Philippines and some Korean workers' families in Korea when they complained about their conditions and they sought union help.
But that's a very different proposition, isn't it, to the one the Prime Minister's been advancing, that to make sure that Australian jobs come first.
Well, Australian jobs should come first, but if there are workers here who are here on 457 visas, they should be looked after. They should get decent conditions. That's what I've fought for all of my life. And I fought for Chinese workers, Filipino workers, Korean workers who were being ripped off. If you're on a 457 visa, the chances of you being injured or killed on the job are far more than an Australian worker. So they should be helped and protected.
Scott, the government's, as I said, the government's beefing up the numbers of people who can check compliance with the visas. Do you see anything wrong with that?
Well, this is just another confected and contrived stunt by Labor to draw attention away from their failure on immigration and border protection issues. Let's just look at some hard numbers. They've cut the amount of money the Department of Immigration has to protect and police immigration and visa issues in Australia from over 70 million to just over 50 million. They've cut the number of people in the Fair Work Ombudsman, because you talk about there being a problem here, but they've never been able to point to prosecutions and problems. The motivation of this is all about trying to provide a distraction for Labor from their complete failure on border protection.
But is there anything wrong with having more people checking that the job description used for the visa is actually the one the worker's working in?
In principle, enforcement of our laws, we've made criticisms of the Labor Party for not enforcing everything to do with immigration. They've failed at everything they've touched. Why on earth anyone would have faith in them picking up this ball and running with it so close to an election, I don't know.
You've been listening to the media moguls today. The hyperbole is over the top.
But you've failed on everything, Doug. You don't even agree with the Labor Party's border protection policy.
But is there a difference, though, Doug, in the language that's being used by the Prime Minister and the sort of language that Bill Shorten was using today, saying he doesn't matter doesn't matter to him where the worker comes from. He's about checking that they are being paid and their conditions are right.
Well, you know, Bill Shorten and I were union officials together. We did many jobs together, and I know Bill's view is the same as mine in terms of 457 visas. That is, if they are appropriate to be used, the workers that come in on those 457 visas should be looked after and protected.
And that's where we'll have to leave it. Doug Cameron and Scott Ryan, thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, Lyndal.
And thank you for joining Capitol Hill today. We'll be back at the same time tomorrow. Until then, good night.